Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. As usual, if you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so. I would greatly appreciate it. And also feel free to leave any comments and or suggestions about what you would like to see next. Okay, so let's jump into it. For today's video, it's going to be another quick one. Kind of just want to cap off what we've been talking about with regards to scheduling a batch job and I guess batch jobs in general. And I think for today, I kind of want to talk about two different interfaces that we can implement for our batchable class right here. You'll see here I already have one. It's called Database.Stateful. And pretty much like how it sounds like, it allows you to keep state across different executions of our batch. And what I mean by that is, let's suppose we instantiated this class. And if we recall, the way we do so is by creating an instance of our class. So for example, I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to create a new instance of this class, like so right here. And then in order to fire this off, this batch off, we call the execute batch method from the database object, and which we could do so by doing database.execute batch right here. And as I said before, the first parameter will be our instance of our class, and the second is an optional parameter or argument rather that we can put in here. And by default, if we don't provide this, the default will be 200, which means that it will process 200 records for every single execution fire here. So if, as an example, this start method right here, this query locator, found 1,000 records that needed to be processed, and we said that we wanted to, or we didn't provide a value here, it would process 200 at a time. So this method would essentially fire 5 times, 200 each time until it processed all 1,000 records here. Now, if we were to provide a value right here, as an example, let's say we just were, because of some limits that we might come across, we only wanted to process 10 at a time. Well, then it would do 100 times, or this would fire 100 times to execute 1,000 times. So I hope that makes sense. But essentially what I was trying to get at is we can use or implement this interface right here to kind of hold state between each of these execution fires. So kind of as an example to show, we can go ahead and create a variable up here outside of our method. And I'll just call this private because I don't think I'm going to use it outside of this class. But as an example, let's create an integer and we'll call this, just call this executed, I guess. And we'll start it off with 0. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to increment this executed variable every single time this execute method fires. To do so, just right here at the top, we'll just say executed ++, and then here in the finish method, let's just output it right here. And we'll just say executed and executed right there. And essentially what should happen is that every single time the execute method fires, this will get incremented. And then once we're done running it, we'll see here the output in our finished. And I guess this is a good time to mention that this video is actually part of a playlist series in which we kind of go over the basics of the Salesforce batch. So feel free to look into the description box below for more details about that. But anyways, essentially what should happen is if this start method found us 100 records to operate on, and we specify that we only want to process 10 at a time, this should return or rather here, it should output a value of 10 for executed, because 10 times, it ran 10 times each time, processing 10 records at a time. So essentially that's kind of how we can keep state across different execution fires. Now, some instances in which this might be useful is kind of like right here. Let's suppose that this finish method was going to do like an email, or send an email once it processes some records, or it's going to do a call out to an external web service, which we'll kind of get into right now. We can use this stateful interface right here to kind of keep track of what is being processed, just to kind of let whoever needs to know about the state of this batch firing, I guess let them know, if that makes sense. I guess let's go ahead and I've saved this. Let's go ahead and fire it right here and see what we kind of get. So I'm going to execute highlighted. And once this is done, let's go ahead and go into our logs right here. And let's click into one of them to see which one has the finish system debug. And you'll see here that in executed, it only fired once. And I think that's because, at least in this trailhead org that I only have 5 records that meet this criteria right here. So let's go ahead and fire it one more time. And this time we're going to say we want to fire it in batches of 1. Now, again, kind of just to quickly recap, the reason why you would want to, I guess, specify the second argument right here is if, as an example, and like I said, we're going to get more into detail in a bit. Let's say this execute method right here was doing a call out to an external web service, and you had like thousands of records that needed to be processed. Well, usually per governor limits, you're only allowed to do 100 Apex callouts per transaction. So if you had 1,000 records right here, you're going to get an Apex exception error or governor limit error. So what you could do is you could basically essentially limit this to like 99 calls per transaction. That way you can kind of get around the error, because essentially every single time this method execute fires, you're starting off with a brand new context and brand new limits, essentially. So yeah, hope that makes sense. But for now, let's just say we want to process these 5 or so records that I have in my org in batches of 1, so basically 1 record at a time. And essentially what should happen is this will get incremented for every single record that we do have in the system. So let's go ahead and execute it one more time. And you'll see here in the logs that we have a lot more of these chunk handlers, essentially because 1 fired for each time, I believe, or something along those lines. But I'm going to go ahead and open up this most previous one. I think that's the one that contains the debug. And you'll see here that executed fired 5 times, which does indeed show that we did have 5 records which met this criteria, and this execute method fired 5 times because we specified in the argument right here that the execute method needs to, or only receive 1 record each time. So essentially that's kind of how we can keep state across each of these execution fires. Now moving on to the next part, and the last thing I want to go over before we wrap this video up is how we can actually go ahead and do a call out in our batch class. And to do so, we implement one more interface. This one is called Database.Allows or allow callouts. Like so, allow callouts. I believe that's the term. Oh, and actually I think it's allows callouts, not allows callout. So both plural, and you'll see here the error went away. So by implementing this interface right here, essentially where this code can now execute a call out in here. And I think what I'm going to do is here we have this simple trailhead right here that kind of goes over how callouts work in Salesforce. And I'll even leave this as a link in the description box below if you need a refresher, which I think I'll also make a video about this in the future. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of copy this code right here because as you see here, they set up this endpoint for us that can just kind of retrieve information. And that's real useful, so we can actually kind of simulate a real world test, I guess, or as close as possible. So essentially, let's go ahead and actually, I'm going to go ahead and create a method right here just to kind of keep our code a bit more tidy. Let's create a private string. So we're going to return a string. We'll call this get animals, I guess, because that was the name of the endpoint right here. And essentially in here, what we're going to do is just plop all this code out, and then we'll kind of just simplify it a bit. So you'll see here, let me go ahead and close this right here. We're making an HTTP object, then we're making an HTTP request object, and then here we set the endpoint, the type, and then here is the actual response itself. We're doing a 200 call. And actually what I think I'm going to do is I want to, I'll just return the entire thing. So let's get rid of this code right here. And actually what I'm going to return is an HTTP response, just because I'm kind of lazy and I don't feel like parsing out what we received back or even checking to make sure we received something appropriate back. So let's just go ahead and return the response back in this method right here. So I'll go ahead and save that. The error message goes away. And basically for every single, I guess, record that we receive in this execute method, in here, I'm going to go ahead and perform that call out. So we'll say something like string animals response equals get animals, just something like that. And I'm not going to do anything special with this. Or actually, let's go ahead and create a variable or a field in our org. So let me go ahead, and it looks like I'm in Classics for some reason. So let's go ahead and jump into Lightning. And I know I'm kind of all over the place with this video, but basically what I just thought of doing right now is let's go ahead and save this response that we're receiving back into a brand new field that we'll create for the supply object. That's kind of what I'm getting at. So let's go ahead and go into our supplies. And then here we'll click on edit object. And let's go ahead and go to fields and relationships. And we'll finally click on this new button right here. And for now, let's just go ahead and create I guess, text area long should be fine. And we'll call this animals payload, just something simple, just to show that we can indeed save that information. Let's go ahead and click next. Oh, that's fine. That's fine. We'll just kind of breeze through all these different setups. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab the field API name and go back into our dev console. And in here, what we're going to say is after you did the call out, and again, this is by no means production code or anything close to it. I'm not doing any parsing. I have no exception handling, no try catches, none of that, which you probably would want to have when working with code that you'd intend to deploy to production. But for now, this is just an example. So this is good enough for now. What we're going to say is, and actually, because I'm lazy, I'm not even going to save this into a string. I'm just going to copy this here and paste it there. So just basically store the output there. And I think we might get an error message. Yes, so seeing here illegal assignment from the HTTP response to string. So all we need to do is do a string.value of, like so. And that should do it. Once it's finished saving, all the errors go away. And essentially what we have is in this execute method, whenever it's fired, it is going to be doing a call out for every single record that's being processed. So, and I guess to like expand upon that a little bit, usually a batch is very great because like I mentioned before, we have our governor limits of only 100 callouts per transaction. But with the batch, every single time this execute method fires, the governor limits essentially get wiped away and you get a clean slate. I mean, you're still subject to like the overall limits, but this is kind of a way to get around that 100 limits per 100 callouts per transaction. Here you can specify how many times you want this, how many records should be passed into this execute method, and then it'll just keep looping forward until it's done processing those records. In terms of real world usage, things I've done with this batch class is, say we need to send a bunch of data over to an external endpoint, whether that be a external partner that's expecting to receive some orders or some kind of information, but you obviously have more than 100 records to send at a time. So what you can do is you can create this batch class and you can even schedule it, which is also a video I made previously. And using pretty much everything we just kind of talked about, you're able to send that information out to your external partner pretty easily. Okay, so anyways, once we have that, let's go ahead and fire off our batch one more time. And I'm going to keep this batch size of 1 just so we can see, again, kind of that it fired once for each payload, or once for each record. That's fine. So let's go ahead and fire this off. Execute highlighted. And once that's done, let's go ahead and click into one of our logs. And it looks like here it executed 5 times. Let's go ahead and go into our front end. And I'm going to just go to the all list view because I don't have any specific list views, just to see the quantities of 0. But essentially what this code had done, if you hadn't watched my previous videos, all it's doing is it's getting all the supply records where quantity equals 0, and then it's setting the status to inactive. Something super simple. So you can see here that we have all these are inactive. These are the 5 records that have been getting operated on. So if we click into, I guess, we'll just click into each one. We should see here in our animals payload, we have basically just the output of that object that was created when we did the call out. Right now, it's just showing that this is the HTTP response, the status OK, and the status code. And it looks like we received it for each one of our records that was performed on. So that pretty much wraps up how we can keep state across execution fires and also perform callouts in our batch class. And I think by now you guys have a little bit more context and information as to how and when these could kind of be useful, hopefully. If not, feel free to leave any questions or comments down below and I'll try to get back to you guys. But yeah, I think that will do it for today's video and I'll catch you guys in the next video.